Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New Orleans, a conversation with Professor John Klingman, brought to you by Architectural Adventures. This webinar will provide you with a detailed overview of the Architectural Adventures trip to New Orleans occurring from October 22nd to 27th in 2017. So thank you all for joining us. Before we get started with the webinar, I'm going to launch a few poll questions to gather some information from our audience, if you don't mind. So let me go ahead and launch our first question. If you don't mind taking a second to answer. So it looks like all of our respondents have always been interested in visiting New Orleans, which is no surprise there. We'll now launch that second question. Have you ever visited New Orleans in the past? Okay, it looks like 56% of our audience have visited New Orleans in the past. So we'll go ahead and close that. So thank you all for answering those poll questions, and we will go ahead and get started. I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about Architectural Adventures tours before we start talking about this itinerary specifically. So Architectural Adventures is the official travel program of the American Institute of Architects. We work with tour operators to provide travelers with expert-led tours that focus on the architecture, culture, and history of premier destinations. We specialize in small group travel that will provide you with an immersive educational experience, and all of our trips are eligible for AIA learning units for AIA members. So if you're an AIA member, you do have that opportunity to make some of your continuing education credits. The New Orleans itinerary is eligible for up to 15 learning units. Our approach to travel also provides you with an opportunity to explore the world's architecture with like-minded individuals. You're going to receive educational guidance and commentary from pre-selected architectural experts, and of course we'll be hearing from the New Orleans expert today. You'll also have an opportunity to participate in special excursions, exclusive behind-the-scenes access, and to get insider knowledge to some of the popular sites that we'll be visiting, as well as lesser-known architecture. The architectural expert for today's webinar for the New Orleans itinerary is Professor John P. Klingman. John is a registered architect who holds a Favreau Professorship in Architecture at Tulane University. So John, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And do you mind telling us a little bit more about yourself?
No, I'd be happy to, Hosty. Hello, everyone, and thanks for your interest in our tour coming up in October. I came to New Orleans in the fall of 1983 in order to teach at Tulane University. Prior to that, I had been in professional practice in Boston, and I had just completed my graduate education in architecture at the University of Oregon. Frankly, I never thought I would end up in New Orleans, but the opportunity to teach here in an environment where the architecture is very specific to the particular circumstances, both cultural and environmental, made it kind of easy to both come here and once I came, as happens to many people, I kind of fell in love with the city. So I've been on the full-time faculty at Tulane University for the time since I came. It's been very rewarding. I've also been active professionally in consulting practice, and we're going to visit one of the buildings that I spent a lot of time working on, the U.S. Custom House in the quarter of the Via Carré. And I've also done some other independent practice, and I've also done a fair amount of writing. In 2012, my book, New in New Orleans Architecture, was published, and it concentrates on 80 outstanding projects from the last 15 years. In addition, I write an annual Best of New Architecture article for New Orleans Magazine. It's actually in the March issue. It just came out. You can Google it if you'd like to see this year's article. And so I'm always looking for new architecture that is complementary and engaged with the issues of the city. At the same time, I think it's really important that we preserve our historic architecture, and I've been on the Architectural Review Committee of our Historic Districts Landmarks Commission for the last 20 years, trying to make sure that our architectural heritage is kept and enhanced. I've also been very active in a group called Docomomo, which is involved in the conservation and preservation of the modern movement of architecture, mostly mid-20th century modernism, of which there's some really interesting examples in New Orleans, and we will see a few of those on our journey as well. So that's a kind of capsule of who I am and what I've been up to.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are extremely lucky to have you as the architectural expert for this trip.
Oh, thanks, Hosty.
So I'm going to start off, before we get started with going over the itinerary and day by day of what we can expect to see on this trip, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about our accommodations. So travelers for this Architectural Adventures trip will be staying at the Whitney Hotel. The Whitney Hotel is actually now on the National Register of Historic Places, so this is an iconic building. It's conveniently located in the heart of the Central Business District, so it's a short walk from the French Quarter, and we're going to be learning all about the French Quarter a little bit later on in the webinar. And it's also 1 block from the historic St. Charles Avenue streetcar line. So you can find more information on the Whitney Hotel at their website, www.whitneyhotel.com. And with no further ado, we're going to get started talking about this exciting itinerary. We will arrive in New Orleans on day 1 of the trip, which is Sunday, October 22nd. After arriving in New Orleans and checking into the Whitney Hotel, you're going to meet your guide and fellow travelers in the late afternoon, and we'll take a walking tour of the Central Business District. So John, what can you tell us about the Central Business District? What can we expect to see today?
Okay, so as I do that, I also want to provide a little bit of a broader maybe outlook for what we're trying to accomplish on the tour. As we know already from the questions, people like to come to New Orleans, and very frequently when people come to New Orleans, their focus is almost entirely on the Via Carré, on the French Quarter. And what people don't really know is that there are at least a dozen, arguably a dozen and a half, neighborhoods in New Orleans that are physically and culturally distinctive and have an awful lot of architectural interest, but frequently people don't know about them and don't really find out about them. So what we're trying to do here is not only provide a sense of the physical and cultural importance of the quarter, but also to introduce people to these other parts of the city that also have a fascinating and really rich heritage that we can discuss. And so the first one of those that we're going to look at is what's called the Central Business District, or the American sector was frequently its name in the 19th century to distinguish it from the Creole center of culture in the French Quarter. So the Lafayette Square, which is seen in this image, is one of 3 really important public squares in New Orleans. Incidentally, all 3 of them are exactly a city block in size, but each one of them was important to a different cultural and historical condition. The first one, obviously, is Jackson Square, which we'll talk about when we talk about the French Quarter. Lafayette Square is the second one, and it was kind of the headquarters, particularly around the middle of the 19th century, for the American government and the American kind of populace within the city. And as such, it's surrounded by significant historic and more recent institutional buildings of both the city government and the federal government, including a fabulous 19th century building, New Orleans' City Hall for 100 years, which is now renamed after its architect, James Gallier. So surrounding the Lafayette Square area, it's very interesting because it's a neighborhood in transition. In the early 20th century and late 19th century, the area was a very important commercial area. It fell into kind of disuse from the 1950s, as happened in many American cities. Many of the buildings were replaced with parking lots, and now it's the most central kind of new neighborhood that is emerging with lots of residential construction from the last year or two and construction going on right now. So it'll be interesting to contrast the historic condition of the 19th century architecture right around Lafayette Square with this 21st century architecture that's going up a few blocks away. Also within a few blocks is the mid-20th century center of city government, which is called Duncan Plaza, which is where New Orleans' 1955 City Hall and outstanding nationally recognized New Orleans Public Library are located. So we'll also be going past those buildings on our little walking tour. So it's a great introduction to see some of the different historic and cultural conditions of the city, including change that's occurring right up to today. Then after that, we will have a reception, and we will walk over into the French Quarter, which, as Hasti mentioned, is about a 10-minute walk from the hotel, and have dinner in the French Quarter at one of the fabulous restaurants that neighborhood hosts.
Excellent. And that also brings us to day 2, where we're going to be spending time in the French Quarter, which is the oldest neighborhood in the city of New Orleans. Founded in 1718, and it has a rich overlapping history and cultural influences. So John, can you tell us a little bit more about the French Quarter?
Yes, the New Orleans was founded in 1718. In fact, our tricentennial is occurring next year, which is we're very, very excited about. And the French engineers laid the city out so that the public square actually fronted the river, and the neighborhood was to be 13 blocks in length and 8 blocks in depth, parallel to the Mississippi River. And it developed that way for the first 50 years or so of French rule, and then the Spanish actually controlled New Orleans for 40 years before the city was sold to the United States government as part of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Many of the buildings in the French Quarter date from the period right around the beginning of the 19th century. There were 2 really important fires in the French Quarter in 1788 and 1794. So the oldest buildings, there are very few that predate those fires, but there are a great many examples of building types that are not seen very commonly in other parts of the United States, and they are completely filling the French Quarter. So we'll be able to explore those building types as we walk through the quarter. But we're going to start off with what you see in the image in front of you, which is a visit to the New Orleans Custom House, which was built by the federal government between 1840 and 1881. And inside of this magnificent granite building, there is an incredible room called the Marble Hall, which is one of the best Greek revival spaces within the United States. So we'll have a chance to go in there, see the Marble Hall and some of the other ancillary spaces in the building, and I'll be able to tell you a little bit about the very unusual and highly interesting history of that particular structure.
Great.
So, yeah, so after the Custom House and walking into and through the French Quarter, we're going to have lunch, and then we are going to look at another neighborhood, which is a very different kind of neighborhood from the quarter. We're going to go to the lower 9th Ward, which became very well known in aftermath of Hurricane Katrina because of the terrible flooding and devastation that has occurred in that neighborhood. So we'll be able to visit several sites within the lower Ninth Ward in which various kinds of reconstruction and rehabilitation are ongoing. And we'll find out about ways in which the city of New Orleans has been making a comeback in very different ways in very different parts of the city. And that'll kind of bring us up to date on the condition and the future of parts of the city that are in a very different kind of cultural and racial condition from the Via Carré. So it'll be a wonderful, I think, contrast. From there, we're going to go to a brand new park along the river in the neighborhoods of Marigny and Bywater, which are both really interesting historic neighborhoods in the city. And we're going to see a David A.J. design bridge. A.J., some of you probably know, is the architect for the new National African American Cultural Center in Washington, D.C. And our park along the river is very important to the city because the city historically treated the Mississippi River waterfront as a industrial river edge. And now it's being transformed into a recreational and pedestrian-oriented river edge for the people of the city. So this is another major redevelopment and refocus on the city that we'll be able to visit firsthand. And that'll complete the organized portion of the Monday tour.
Great, which brings us to day 3 of the itinerary. So on this day, we're going to start the day with a walking tour of the Garden District. What can you tell us about the Garden District?
Well, the Garden District was the Americans' response to the French Quarter. The Americans and the people of French and Spanish and Caribbean descent who lived in the parts of the city below Canal Street did not get along very well. In fact, at one point, there were 3 different city governments in New Orleans. The Americans decided to show the French people how a neighborhood should be planned. And so they took a part of the city that's essentially exactly the same size as the French Quarter and exactly the same size blocks as the French Quarter blocks, but instead of 12 properties per block in the Garden District, there are 4. And what that means is that the houses have extensive landscaping around them. And in contrast to the French Quarter, where the buildings are all tight to the street and the landscape and the amenity occurs within the courtyards of the buildings rather than on the street. So it's a kind of amazing contrast between this model of almost suburban development. In fact, sometimes the Garden District is called the first American suburb. And there are a great many really interesting buildings and really interesting landscape elements of the neighborhood, and it's very walkable, it's very pleasant, it's very verdant, many street trees, also in contrast to the Via Carré, where the trees are in courtyards rather than along the street. So that's a really, it's another high point of the city. Now, adjacent to the Garden District on the riverside is another neighborhood about the same size called the Irish Channel. And the Irish Channel was named for all the Irish people who lived there in the 19th century when they worked on the docks and in other parts of the working class avenues within the city. This is now a changing neighborhood. It has much smaller buildings than the larger structures of the Garden District, and many of them are now being renovated and transformed into 21st century dwellings. So it's a really interesting contrast and complement. So we'll have lunch in the Garden District. You can see Commander's Palace, which is actually a neighborhood restaurant in the Garden District. And then from there, we will leave that part of town and go to a neighborhood called Treme, which is directly on the lake side of the French Quarter, but it has a very different feel from the French Quarter, and it's kind of marked in particular by a public square called Congo Square, which is right on the river edge of the neighborhood. Congo Square has an enormous importance for African American history, and also for the history of jazz. And we'll talk about that when we're on the site. So that's going to be our third neighborhood for Tuesday, and then after the Treme tour, we will go over to the National World War II Museum and discuss this project, which now has 7 buildings and another 1 or 2 to come. It's among the 10 most popular tourist destinations in the United States, and this has all happened within the last 15 years or so, and we will hear that story and find out what the cultural and architectural conditions of that complex are all about.
Which brings us to day 4, where we're going to be touring Plantations. You see a picture of Evergreen Plantation on your screen. John, what can you tell us about the plantations we're going to visit today?
Well, the plantation condition actually occurred all up and down the lower Mississippi River, including New Orleans and below New Orleans in the very early history of the city. Now the plantations that remain are most all above the city along the river, and so there are some very interesting things to see. Now, my understanding is that before the plantations themselves, there's actually going to be a tour of a pumping station that is a very important component of the New Orleans area drainage system. So this is something that's a major element of infrastructure that's going to start off the day. And then I think the high point of the day is going to be the Whitney plantation. Many of the plantations focus upon the kind of cultural and agricultural economy of the plantation system, and in fact, the one that you're seeing here on the screen, Evergreen, is going to be one that is visited, where you'll hear and understand that story. Whitney, though, presents the plantation condition from a very different perspective, the perspective of African American slaves, and it's a very moving experience to see the evidence and see monuments within the Whitney plantation, where there are quotations from the people who were enslaved in this system, and it's something that's really a kind of history that has been not very well known until recently, and the Whitney plantation is now, I think, maybe 2 years old, 2.5 years old. So this is a completely new way of approaching the this particular piece of history, and I think it's wonderful that the tour is including that as an important component on this day.
Okay, and on day 5, we are going to explore modern architecture in New Orleans. So John, what can you tell us about the modern architecture we might expect to see and about this day as a whole?
Well, I think it's a wonderful day in the sense that we are also on this day visiting 3 or 4 other New Orleans neighborhoods, each of which has some very interesting and important aspects, both in terms of new architecture and also in terms of urban fabric. So we'll start off with a neighborhood called Broadmoor, which was one of the most severely flooded in Hurricane Katrina. And the Rosa Keller Library and Community Center is kind of the flagship of the neighborhood's redevelopment. It's both a brand new building and a historic house from early in the 20th century that have been combined to form this institutional presence. It's a really terrific project. Then we will head toward an important historic part of New Orleans, the area around a small stream called Bayou St. John, on which a house from 1799 is open for our visit. It's called the Pitot House. It was owned by an early governor, an early mayor rather, of the city of New Orleans, and it's a fabulously interesting, although rather small house compared to plantation houses. Nearby there is one of the major parks of New Orleans, City Park, and after we have lunch at a wonderful local restaurant there, we will be visiting the sculpture garden of the New Orleans Museum of Art, which is a complex of pavilions and sculptures around some lagoons on a lake within the park. It's a project that was done about 15 years ago and is ongoing, and we will be visiting with one of the architects from the project and learning about the nature of the sculpture garden. Next, and very nearby to that, is the image that you're seeing on the screen right now, which is an image of the working area of something called the Grodat Youth Farm, which is a place where urban kids can learn about vegetables. They can learn by farming and growing. They can learn by harvesting and preparing them for food. So it's an ongoing institution, now about 5 years old, and it includes this wonderful structure that's made from shipping containers, low-cost structure for a low-budget project that we will find out about and kind of learn how this farm and its pavilions work together. So it's really kind of an inspiring project, and it's working out really well for both for the children and for the organization that's founded this project. Then we will go over to the University District, which is next to New Orleans' other very important park, Audubon Park, and we will do some looking around at both houses and university buildings at Tulane and Loyola universities. The Tulane campus in particular is one of the great college campuses of the United States. And so we'll be seeing a little bit and understanding a little bit about how that campus developed, and we'll also be looking at a couple of wonderful buildings on the campuses, and that'll complete the afternoon. And then after going back to the hotel, we're going to find a wonderful farewell dinner at a terrific restaurant in the Via Carré.
And sadly, that brings us to the last day of this itinerary, which will be day 6. After checking out the hotel, we'll spend a final morning in New Orleans before transferring independently to the airport for return flights. But keep in mind, this trip is Sunday to Friday. How it's structured is you may choose to arrive earlier or depart a little bit later and explore New Orleans on your own. But I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to explain this itinerary to us. Obviously, I think all of the travelers will get a wonderful view and foundation of New Orleans and its historical, cultural, culinary aspects. So thank you so much for leading this tour and also talking with us today.
Oh, thanks, Hosti. You know, let me say something about the weather also, because New Orleans has some fairly extreme weather. But not in October. It turns out October is one of the best months to come to New Orleans. It tends to be clear. The days may be warm. The evenings will be very pleasant, and it's an excellent time to come. It's not like August and it's not like July, and so it's a terrific time of year to visit the city.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Now, for any of our audience on the phone, if you have any questions about this itinerary or questions about architectural adventures, please contact us at 1-800-293-5725. You can also email us at travel@architecturaladventures.org or visit our website at architecturaladventures.org. I'm going to launch one final poll. If you would like us to contact you regarding this trip, just indicate yes, and we will give you a call after today's webinar. So take a few seconds just to answer that question. And again, you can find more information about this on our website or contacting us at 1-800-293-5725. We can provide you all of the information regarding this itinerary and others. I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll now, so thank you so much for answering that question. And I will end with this snapshot of the 2017 trip schedule from Architectural Adventures. Again, you can learn more on our website. This month in March, we actually completed our first inaugural Architectural Adventures trip to Havana, Cuba, and we're currently in Barcelona. So please visit our website and to learn more about these other itineraries. And again, I want to thank John for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you all. We hope you found this webinar helpful, and have a wonderful afternoon.